Okay, I've thought about 5 different ways I could probably approach this, but let me just try to do it from this variation here. We're looking at Egyptus. Egyptus is an ancient Greek mythology, and there indeed in ancient times was a river up not too far from the Danube known as the Egyptus. And they have a mythology quite often that has to do with brothers, and you can see that brother mythology echoed all over the place. It's even somewhat seen in the Sumerian idea of having Enki and then Enlil, but then, and they would be half brothers if you would, which sometimes causes those problems that they try to mythologically pull out of that. But then the brothers of, Romulus and Remus, and you wonder where Remus went, huh? Because Romulus became Rome, and where did old Remus go? And we can get into that in another video and so on. But then there's also the ideas of the followers of uh, Shimsu-Hor and Horus, and how the starting of Egypt as we know it, which is a Greek name, uh, has a brother in it too, which is Set, which is also seen as Seti, and you see even great emperors name that. And generally, Seti are red-headed people. It's been found out a long time back now, but deeply dug into, that the necropolises there are separated with different hair-colored people, and it's believed that that goes along with that idea, and that somehow that would be a nomenclature they would have given to pharaohs, that if he's the red-headed pharaoh, then he would have been a Sethite or a Seti. You also see this mentioned in Seth, and then Seth seen biblically, of course, which has ancient attaches to Egypt and folklore and tales about that. Seth is mentioned in the Bible as being the other one, that the Cain slew Abel, and then he was banished out, and so that's supposed to later show you an attach to the Canaanites and stuff, a direct connection to that. But then we also see that there were the Sethites that would come from that also, most people don't think of, and then that would also attach to being Seti or Sethites, Set, and a sunset, and it's attached to red. Sunsets are red, they glow and turn red. But a lot of these words are, like Egypt and stuff, are Greek words. We know that, Africa's named from a Greek man. It's a Greek name. Greeks named a lot of things that name stuck, and it's because it was changed during the Greek hierarchy that was over the entire area during that time. Indeed, they named Persia itself, and it stuck to those people. So there was a lot of naming, and by this naming, you can definitely see a diaspora of knowledge that a lot of people don't want to agree to of having happened. But it's well noted even that up in 7th century BC, Greeks were all over Egypt and well welcomed in, and back and forth as somewhat of a brother. And in fact, the ancient tale of Atlantis itself speaks of each other as being pretty much a brother, and I have had this happen, but you don't remember. And he goes on into the tale in some ways. In a lot of the Amarna documents later, he talks about them being brothers and so on, and the people up there having been their ancient brethren. But so let's look into this. Egyptus, according to Greek mythology, is a descendant of the heifer maiden Io and the river god Nilus, and he was a king of Egypt. Now, the heifer maiden is usually a red heifer. You see them all, and of course that's why we have a lot of red cows nowadays, because this unblemished and this sacred red cow that you can see from the Minoans, and I'll mention that here in a minute. You can see the attachment, but they of course had the bull, and of course they had the labyrinth and all the things that go with that, and the Cretan people, and this red and red ochre that goes with this whole concept of these people, and while that might have been chosen and so on. But Io, and of course Io is here shown as the bull there on the side, and she's one of the mortal lovers of Zeus. She was an ancestor of many kings and heroes, such as Perseus of the Persians, Cadmus of the Persians, Hercules, King Minos, Lynceus, which means the lynx cat, Cepheus. There's all kinds of different ones that go along with this. Definitely people have seen these attachments, but a lot of time this is all just looked at as mythology. So let's look into something that was said about Aegyptus, because this is a word that was transposed onto Egypt itself. The Egyptians didn't call themselves Egypt. They referred to the fertile area as being Kemet. This was the dark soil that surrounded the Nile in a ribbon on either side, and it was what they utilized to make all their farming out of. And these farming people and these cattle people, and the cattle has been seen to have come from up in this northern area. It comes from there in Sumeria. So does cuneiform, so does most of the things that start off at primordial Egypt, along with the people that were endemically there. But so Egyptus was the son of King Belus of Egypt and Ikero. Now Belus, you can construe out into Baal eventually, and the hierarchy that came out of that. And Belus goes along with the Canaanite pantheon there, and so you have the gods of the pantheon that really mimics a Sumerian type pantheon. You know, Baal's like a storm god, but he's also seen as the sun. Most things have a dual application to them in these ancient look, especially looking back at them now, you can definitely see like the dual application to it, that was all about the sun, but then also all the aspects of the things that work with it. And Ikero here is something special. She's according to a lot of Greek scholars, they think it's a mistake of Ankiro, and so this would have on into it, as in Anana or on, and Cairo has to do with Charon and the boatmen of the lower plains, and this concept of idea of Typhon, which actually goes with the tribe of Dan and Danaus and the Danites that are all spoken about in ancient Greece and Romans through that time later. The idea here, she was a mythical naiad, which is equivalent a lot of times to people think of as fairies and things and butterflies. And in fact, Ankiro is actually the name of a genus. It means moths. It's basically to go with those. And then Danaus is the genus of butterflies like monarchs. And it's a monarch, and it has that red in color, and people wonder why Latin goes with this, and this Proto-Indo-European languages that quite often go together with each other. And she's supposed to be the mythical naiad, right, and a daughter of the river god Nilus. And this Nilus concept is where we get the idea of the Nile, that the Greeks thought that that was one of the river gods in Nile, and so they named it the Nile. But the name that the ancient Egyptians called their river was the Ar, as in A-R or A-U-R, and we looked at as being with the sun that they had, and of course they worship the sun. They're all sun worshippers too, from the ancient Proto-European concepts that all led to their major religions. And of course, calculating the sun and stuff lets you work with the seasons, astronomy and astrology, and work out timelines and seasons and things along that line. But in the ancient times, people use the sun in much different ways, but we still see that name Ar and an R or Ur reflected in many things. But auras are to glow, right? And aurora is the sun, aurora, and we even see that in like that's the name of one of the princesses, you know, and so on. And that has a lot to do with things too. It's funny how there's little bits of pieces of everything in your life, like a web, but once you can put it all together, it becomes this whole thing that you may not even see from one side. But if I tell you to come over here and take a look at it from this side, because it looked like gibberish over there to you, well, that's because you're looking at it backwards. Because if you come over here and you take a look at it, it starts to make a little too much sense when you put certain things together. Let me put a few together for you. So Egypt, and Cairo was a naiad of the daughter of Nile. She was the twin brother, Egyptus was the twin brother of Danaus, or Dan, king of Libya. And Libya at this ancient time used to be all of Africa. They called it all Libya, basically. while Euripides adds two others that she sired, or that they did together: Cephas, who is king of Ethiopia, and Phineas, and he was the one that was betrothed of Andromeda. And whenever you get that idea of Andromeda, this is the idea of the first recanting of, on the Mediterranean, of the idea of the Kraken, and how she was meant to be sacrificed, and this concept that they had back then with human sacrifice. Andromeda is the daughter of the Ethiopian king Cephas and his wife Cassiopeia. When Cassiopeia hubris leads to her boast that Andromeda is more beautiful than the Nereids, Poseidon, Neptune, sends the sea monster Cetus, or the Kraken, to ravage Andromeda as divine punishment. And she gets chained out there, and I think a lot of us have seen Clash of the Titans, and so you can see that concept that comes out of it. Wish I could just show you the video clip now, but every time I try to do that, I get flagged like hell because I have a mouse in my pocket. Anyhow, he may be the same or different from another Egyptus who is called the son of Zeus and Thebes, but I tell you it's not. And Thebes is up in ancient Egypt, but there's a Thebes up here, and there's a Thebe down there, and there's an Egyptus up here, and they call that Egypt down there. It's kind of strange. There's a story that goes along with this, though. Egyptus fathered 50 sons by different women, 6 of whom were a woman of royal blood called Agraphia. And this is where our Argrophia, this is where you get Argos from, but Ar, and the river Ar, and the delta, and the people that lived around the Mediterranean there. Later we call them Canaanites, and then the areas that have a lot of merchant work we call Phoenicians. But the Phoenicians themselves name were Canaan. So that's all the same thing, really. And what we think of nowadays, or get told nowadays, isn't really the way that it was. And there's only one glimpse or a moment of time that it almost seemed the way that they try to project nowadays. But that's another story. So 6 of those 50 were from royal blood from that area there. So we would think of these as Carthaginian or Phoenician or Canaanite or Philistine women, but Philistines come in a little later. I don't want to have to go there in this. 10 by an Arabian woman, and the people of Yemen, who at an ancient time, if you look at all their statuary and everything, used to look very Greek, and not the people of the Arabs and Arabia that we think of today. This also cants to maybe like the Queen of Sheba. So you look at Sabaeans, basically, and ancient Sabaean art. 7 by a Phoenician woman. She had 7 kids. 3 by Tyrea, which is Tyre, so that's up there, designating that Tyre is different than Phoenicia. Isn't that strange? But let's continue. 12 by the Naiad Calydne. Now, she's a river naiad too. In Greek mythology, the naiad of the river Nile, presumably one of the daughters of the river god Nilus himself. She was one of the wives of Egyptus, bearing him 12 sons. And here's all the names of them: Nophantes, Peristhenes, Hermas, Dryas, Dryad, if you will, Podamon, Lixus, Imbruxus. These names can go, I could go on about what those break down into in small ideas, but also Caliadne has a lot to do with Caledonians. Yeah, and Caledonian. Where's Caledonian? Does anybody even remember what Caledonia is? For Caledonia is to do with Britain and Scotland, Ireland, and that whole area in Wales, and so on. Caledonia, New Caledonia, was off of Australia. It's an island that's there, New Caledonia. Some still call it that to this day. Anyhow, so there's a lot that go with that, and I could probably go and I could do a whole video on Caledonia. Perhaps I will shortly. 6 more children by Gorgo. So this is like the Gorgons, but not what you're thinking of course. They were said to be the most beautiful. In fact, seems like whenever they said they were more beautiful than the gods, they got cursed. But you know, that's just another like inkling concept. Anyhow, and last, another 6 by Hephaestion, and this would be the fires and forges of Hephaestus that was in this Canaanite area that was down here too, Hephaestus and the forges, and this lets you know where certain things kind of come from. Now, according to Hippostratus, Egyptus had these progenies by one single woman called Uriel. Now, this is a strange thing because that kind of puts it all with a European flavor to it, doesn't it? But that's strange. In saying that Uriel was a daughter of the Nile. We look at genetics nowadays and they say, well, the King Tut's closest genetics are up over here in Britain and stuff, and it leads all the way up into Russia, and even czars of Russia had this same haplotype group. It seems strange, but maybe not, if people weren't taught wrong things in history. In some accounts, Egyptus consorted with Isai, which is kind of like Sais. That's where that kind of comes from. While Danaus married Malia. These two women were daughters of their uncle Agenor, king of Tyre. So now we have that area again. Of their possible sister Damno, who was described as the daughter of Belus. And Dam is where we get dames from, as in, well, Notre Dame, the North woman. Notre Dame, the northern woman. Anyhow, Malia also. Maluha was a name for ancient India, by the way, and to the Sumerians. But the name Malia, an ancient Greek word for ash trees. In the plural, the Malia were a class of nymphs associated with trees, particularly ash trees. There were several other nymphs named Malia, not necessarily associated with those, but in ancient times there were sacred groves and sacred forests. This is another thing that Proto-Indo-Europeans started from way back before recorded histories, because they had lived in certain ones, and then there were plains in between. There were sacred areas they would go to and so on. So you have the oaks, the druids and so on, and you have the sacred groves that you have in Upper Sumeria that they talk about, and the Lebanon cedars in Lebanon that they talk about, and so on. And these are generally an evergreen type of tree, except for in a few occasions. But in those occasions, they have a lot of Christmas mythology that goes with the seasons too, mistletoe and things along that line. Anyhow, so again, Damno is described as the daughter of Bel himself. And when we look at Baal's sister was Anat, and it's where we get Anatolia from. To this day, these names are still held here. Phoenix of the Phoenicians, which also is a date palm, like a Johnny Appleseed kind of concept. I think quite often whenever I do these, I go too far out in left field, but right now I'll tell you, I could go farther out in left field and just keep doing it on much everything that we talked about. And in doing so, I think I'd lose everybody. Egyptus ruled Arabia and conquered nearly every country ruled by people called Malimpodes, and called it by his name, Egypt. So Egyptus once ruled Arabia, or a land much more to the east, where the Tigris and Euphrates come in on that side in the Arabian Gulf, and conquered a nearby country ruled by people called Malimpodes and called by its name Egypt. That sounds familiar. Egyptus fathered 50 sons who were all but one murdered by 49 of the 50 daughters of Egyptus's twin brother Danaus, the Danites. So Danaus is an eponym of the Danites, we see here. So when we talk about Danites, we're talking about Dan and the tribe of Dan. And these women here, it's always symbolically shown later that they're always filling up an urn, and somehow their urns leak. Well, back in the day, they were using pottery. It seeped constantly, but the giant effigies out in front of the churches of the holy water that they had out front, they were ginormous. The ones that are stated in front of the temple of Jerusalem itself, up on all of its cows and sacred cows that are around, up under it. That thing was huge, and these women spent all day getting it back, but that gets changed into a strange story. A scholium on a line in Euripides of Hecuba in 866 reverses these origins. A scholium is like a It's a side note. Back in the day, they would write things out. Whenever they'd go back over it in their mind, a lot of times they would write things in the side margin. In fact, it's believed that this was such a practice even at the starting of writing. That's the reason the margin was kept so far in most of writings and stuff. I think it'll tell you that. It's a grammatical critical explanation of comments in a side margin. Placing the twin brothers at first in Argolis. There's that R again. Again, the name of the Nile was the river Ar. Nilus was the god over that. Egypt called their god Happy. We think of Happy Dene as being gleeful or happiness. And this golden river they called the Ar. The god of that river was happy. Whence Egyptus was expelled and fled to a land that was named after him. So he's saying that it went the other way. That's strange. In the more common version, Egyptus commanded that his 50 sons marry the 50 Danites, and Danaus with his daughters fled to Argos. Ruled Pelasgus. Now Pelasgus, this is strange. This goes with Pelasgians and stuff, and everybody wants me, or I've had a few people request on it, and I said I'll get there when it rolls into it. I'm getting there, but I'll have to do a separate one on it totally, but they have to do with Cyclopean stone builders. Anyhow, in Greek, Pelasgus was the Epinos ancestor of the Pelasgians. They were the mythical inhabitants of Greece who established the worship of the Diodorian Zeus himself, Hephaestus, and Kabiri, and other divinities. In other parts of the country, once occupied by Pelagians, there existed other connected things. And of course, Zeus is a storm god with his lightning bolts. And whenever I tell you all these gods of Greece were from gods of the whole area, they weren't just talking about some mountain range around Olympus and things happening there. It's what's going on here. You can tell they're talking about countries all over the place. They're not talking about here. They're saying in the world, and the known world, and that's what it's known as. We get the word out of this, pale. We also get the word out of this, pelas and pelar, which means to peel or to open, and with fruit. It has to do with that, and that has to do with Latin and so on. We get a few other things in Pallas. Is supposed to be connected directly with this, in Palestine, and the Philistines, and Philiscus. Or by Gelanor, whom Danaus replaced, and Gelanor would have been living in the area first. King Gelanor of Argos was the son of the successor. His real name was Pelasgus. The name Gelanor is literally a device meaning laughter. He was so called because he had initially laughed at the claim of kingship over Argos by Dan. So he was jolly, and it's where you get jolly and jelly, jiggle, or whatever. Anyhow, whom Danaus replaced. So now we get the idea of Dan coming in and replacing that, but his name was Pelasgus, and this was in the area of the Argos running into the Mediterranean. Okay? When Egyptus and his sons arrived to take the Danites, Danaus relinquished them to spare the Argives the pain of battle. And so what he ended up doing was giving, in a treatise, he gave a bunch of his sacred daughters, which were probably not all related to him in any way, shape, or form, although they may have been through a process of all of his concubines. Though they may have just been some of his concubines, they may have been other enslaved women, they may have been sacred priestesses. Not too sure how this goes down because it all comes across in this wispical mythology concept. But so, however, he instructed his daughters to kill their husbands on that wedding night. And this is a famous story I could probably go into with its own 30-minute deal. This is probably going to go into a double anyhow. 49 followed through, but one, Hypermenestra, which means greatly woed, or hyper, we know hyper, is greatly hyperactive. Hyper, and Menestra has to do with estrogen, and we were talking about Easter, and how this has all to do with a woman's woes, and back then women were mourners, and this woman greatly woed so bad after being married into it that she refused, and didn't kill him. And why? Because, well, she wasn't taking advantage of sexually that night, as all the others had done, and then whenever they slept, they had killed them. Licinius, which means the lynx man, honored her wish, her husband, to remain a virgin, because she had greatly woed. Danaus was angry with this disobedient daughter, though, and threw her to the Argive courts. Aphrodite herself is said to intervene and saved her. Licinius and Hypermnestra founded the lineage of the Argive kings, and that's listed as a Danaid dynasty. So where does these people in the tribe of Dan come from? And they talk about whenever the Greeks put together this Bible later, and they're getting it all together for us here on the people over this area, because who ruled this area at this time was Egypt, and then Persia running through, of course, the Akkadians, some through this area, and then we also have the Greeks that come through, and then later finishing off the Romans, who at Titus kind of take the second coming, exactly when Jesus says, and carry it on through there. But it falters much later. We'll get to there in a few other videos, but then we're starting to get out of the ages I like to talk about. I like to stay back in more mythical times and figure out the depth of how it came about, but then you also start to see where it turns into. Sometimes I don't like seeing where it turns into. That's why I don't like looking at too much modern stuff. In some versions, though, Licinius, the lynx man, later slew Danaus as a revenge for the death of his brothers, and so he killed her, and the Danites were punished in the underworld by being forced to carry water through jugs with holes in them, or a sieve, like like how you sift out vegetables and how you sift out noodles whenever you boil noodles, and then you run them through a sieve. So like they're supposed to carry that, so it's exaggerated, so that the water always leaked out. And again, I'm telling you, this really had to do with people having to fill up in front of churches, and that at one time a people of this faith had sent a bunch of these women to be under this church to end up fulfilling this concept. And later you hear people talking about it, and then now we have a totally different view on what this might have even had to do with anything. The story of Danaus and his daughters and the reason for their flight from marriage provided the theme for Aeschylus' the Suppliants. And the Suppliants is an ancient, and you can see the woman coward laying down here. The Suppliants it's called the Suppliant Maidens or Suppliant Woman too. So suppliant women. It's a play by Aeschylus. It was probably first performed around 470 BC, back at these times, as the first play in a tetralogy, sometimes referred to as the Danaid tetralogy, which is probably included in the lost plays, the Egyptians, and others, which, man, it would be real important if we could get that, the Egyptians play and what it said, wouldn't it? There are some scraps and thoughts people give out, though, but let's look at this Argive genealogy. Now, this is Argos. This is about the ancient tales that they have, right? Yeah? And the Golden Fleece and all that. So it goes from Inachus and Melia. So what is this? Well, there's Enoch of your Bible and the concept of story. And then of Melia. Now they have Pharonius. And then they don't describe him much more, but you can see his effigy here off of it. And it really breaks off some, but he's a culture hero of the Argonauts. He's a fire bringer. Primordial kings of Argos. Fire bringer. The original idea of Hephaestus and Phoron and Pharaoh and fires and pyramids, pyramids, fire towers. Let's continue here. So, well, Enoch and everything, they end up having Zeus and Io, right? And this is from the chronology. And then Io, they have Ephesus and Memphis. Well, Memphis is down in Egypt. So what did Zeus has attached to that? Yeah, and their kids are Libya. And then you have Poseidon. What? Okay, yeah, so it breaks from there, though. You have over here, which is a lot more Persian, Aryan over here, and then you have the same guys, but they come from the same form source, they say. Kind of like, oh, I don't know, in the Bible, it's kind of led you to believe that there's 3 kids of Noah, and they spread out and become all these people. Now, in a modern day, they try to say it became 3 races somehow, but no. know it perfect in its generations, and this is a Caucasian Bible. It really isn't about the India people or Asians or Eskimos or Negroes or anything else other than all the Caucasians here through Egypt and North Africa and around the whole Mediterranean. But so let's focus on this side here. So you have Bel and Akiro together, and now they form the Danites, Piera, and Egyptus. And Egypt is hooked up through the lynx and the cat, and Licinius was the king of Argos. There's later depictions of him here that are done in the 16th century, 13th, 14th centuries. But so there's Hypermnestra too, and she continued on. They had children, so it broke down more. But here we have Sparta attached to it, and the Lacedaemons, Eurydice, Acrisius, Zeus again with Danae, forming Perseus. And it's told by Herodotus himself in True Histories that he was trying to write, some of which is quite a bit of hearsay though, where Persia was not called Persia before, and Media was not called Media before. None of this land down here that he was talking about, running from Egypt all the way over, was called by the names they were. They were all called Aryans by ancient people, and you find the river Ar in Egypt, and it kind of makes some sense there. But all these people were called Aryans, and then when Medes came from Persia, came from Athens to Media, or the people we call the Medes, they changed their name just as Persia had done when Persis had come. So you find this concept, and I'm telling you that, so there's Perseus and where he is, but it's all the way down in Persia, and you find that King Agenor here and Cadmus, and this has to do with the Persians and Cadmus and his Cambyses and so on that come after these people here, and how they bring harmonia to the whole people. As the snake grows so large it turns around and bites itself, and the circle of life starts forming here. You get Polydorus, Agave, Ino, Auteno, Semele, and Zeus get together and make Dionysus, so you can see where that comes from too. And then you get the Phoenicians and Phoenix and Europa, who was a daughter of the Phoenicians and Canaanites, and that's the reason Europe is named what it is. That also, later, Africa gets renamed from Libya, which is from over there, into Africa as it's known today, and Libya becomes a large portion of the northern part of Africa that people were inhabiting at a later point. And so you can also see that Europa and Phoenix attached to King Minos, and so this would have to do with Crete and the bull sacrifice and things that were over there. But also Menes is also said to have been one of the first and originators of Egypt and getting it pulled together too. So there's more contradiction pulled between these things. But King Minos was the man on Crete that before it had been destroyed or so on, but the Minotaur that we all know of, and of course Minos, Minotaur, Taurus being the bull, and so you get the bull of the King Minos, and how that had happened, and how that get changed to a different idea. But that bull hunting thing is all taken even until Italy, and you still see bullfighting to this day, and the sacred bulls that we talked about before. So you can see this kind of is where Egyptus comes from, and Egypt took its name from his, according to folk etymology, see the Coptics. Thus for Euripides, in his tragedy Helen, Egyptus was become Egypt itself. Proteus, while he lived, was king here, ruling the whole of Egyptos from his palace island in island of Pharos, and that's where you get the idea of Pharaohs from. Pharos is the name, it means big house, and that's not what the kings called themselves. They lived in a big house, but Pharos is the island where the Alexandrian lighthouse was. But that comes a little later than all this stuff we're talking about by far, doesn't it? Now, you talk about here, it's showing you where Baal works up together. Baal means Lord, and Belos, Lord, is simply Hellenized rendition of Baal, a Semitic term, not an Egyptian one necessarily. And so, but you do have Baal Hamon and Ammon, and where you get that concept, the concept of foot, that's around there also, and how this works together with Mizraim and the people out of the Bible and so on. But Baal and Baal worship, yeah, Baal, Canaanite deity, whoops, sorry, Canaanite deity, it basically means Lord, but also in the Bible, they're Baal worshippers quite a bit too, and it's a different thing. It's not just meaning Lord, it means this deity here that people try to mull over, and they tried for centuries and centuries to mull over, but now so much has been found about it, and you realize, hey, this all goes with that whole Bible thing, and the whole sacred bull and Yahweh, and yeah, that's where this comes from, is a mixing of ancient Proto-Indo-European stuff through the Sumerians. Of course, Abraham came from Ur, so you get that idea. Now we're going to look at a different idea of Egyptus here. We're going to look at a few different ones of Egyptus, if you will. I'm going to look next probably at the Mormon version, although it's somewhat racist and a little bit controversial. It's the other concept running off of this. But hopefully in this I show you where Dan and Danites and the red-headed tribe of Dan, and were they all redheads? Oh hell no, it's just they kept us, it's sacred, and it seems like a lot of the rulers were just like what was his name, King David, yeah, Solomon and stuff are said to be described in this same manner, in this same area. People want to act like, oh well, the people there now have a lot of admix and stuff, and they're Arabic, and so that's what people look like there thousands of years ago, and it's like, no, that's not necessarily true, and the people in Egypt aren't really genetically related exactly to the old ancient Egyptians either, and so on. People in certain areas aren't the people that used to be there just a few thousand years ago. Yeah. One example of that, actually, that you could just see modernly would be America. But that's a whole different story, isn't it? Anyhow, guys, now we'll get on from this and go to the next one. But like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. And here's where the name Egypt comes from. Peace.